Hello, Booktopia, and welcome to a very special live stream that we're hosting tonight with Dr. Michael Mosley. Hello, Michael. Welcome to Booktopia.
Hi there. Greetings from the UK.
So thank you for joining us. It's the morning for you, obviously, and we thank you for getting up to be with all of us. What's your life been like recently in isolation?
Fairly peculiar because, as you know, the UK has been very badly hit by COVID-19. We have pretty much the highest death rates per capita of anywhere in Europe. And so lockdown has been pretty, draconian, if you like. But I have my wife here and one of my sons and my daughter. And it's kind of odd. I've been able to film because making documentaries is still seen as an essential service. So I have made a couple of documentaries for the BBC, series Horizon, which I believe has been on in Australia, looking at COVID-19. And I've also I write a column, so I've continued to do that. So from that extent, it's going to be normal, but it's sort of weird not being able to get out, see friends and things like that.
I made a note to ask whether you've been productive in quarantine. That sounds like you really have. And I guess it's almost a silly question because you wrote an entire book during this period as well.
Yes, I did. So I started actually writing the book on COVID-19 in February, and it was fortunate because I was at the same time doing a documentary, or indeed two documentaries about it. So I had access to all the experts and I chatted to them, and I got a lot of information, a lot of feedback. But I wanted to write a book which was not going to be immediately out of date. So I wanted something which would stand the test of time. And so far it has. So the book itself kind of breaks down into looking at what we know about the virus itself. And, one of the art of war is to understand your enemy. And that is one of the things that we know a lot about the virus. We know a lot about our vulnerabilities. I also did a section looking at the history, the first 100 days, because that's not going to change. And then lots of Q&A. And so I think pretty well everything in that book is up to date, including looking at drugs and vaccines. And the vaccines, which I write about, they're still all bang on target to do pretty much what I predicted in the book. So so far, it's been a fascinating journey writing a book in the middle of a pandemic. But I've been a science journalist now for 30 years, and this is the most extraordinary story, if you like. It's been a tragedy, but it has been an extraordinary scientific story. And I wanted to document it for my own sake, if nothing else.
So what led you to write this book and to make that decision to jump in and write something so immediate?
It was very much the fact that I was talking to these scientists anyway. I was reading huge amounts of these studies, which were being published all the time. And I thought, I know all this stuff, why don't I share it? Because there's a huge amount of misinformation out there, a huge amount of confusion. And I was getting a lot of really interesting, really helpful, very useful data, which I wanted to share with people. And not only about, about the virus and a bit about its history, but also how to bolster your immune system and what the prospects are for things like the drug therapies and particularly the vaccines. And I'm actually feeling more optimistic than I was when I started writing the book. Things have progressed on the scientific front faster than anyone would ever have predicted. I mean, it really has been the Manhattan Project for biology. Huge amounts of money, huge amounts of research, huge amounts of advances. So it's been absolutely fascinating as a science journalist to document this stuff. And as the feedback has been really good, which is great, particularly from the scientific community, a lot of virologists I know, so I sent it to them, the immunologists, just to check out, but also from people who kind of don't know their neutrophils from their macrophages. So I do give you a bit of a guide to the immune system, because I think illustrated as well by my niece, Emily, because I thought it was an opportunity to educate people about how their immune system works. Because it's obviously a huge part of why some people become seriously ill and other people don't.
Could you tell us a little bit about some of the misconceptions about coronavirus that you mentioned before?
Sure, there are lots of crazy ones going out there. For example, the idea that, the COVID-19 is somehow linked in with the 5G network, and so people are burning down Mars. There are some truly balmy theories. Also, eating garlic. There are lots of foods which it's claimed will protect you. One woman I read about ate 2 kilograms of garlic and had to be admitted to hospital with serious garlic overdose. So I can tell you now, garlic does not do that. Garlic I'm a huge fan of, and one advantage of eating garlic is that if you can smell garlic on the breath of the person you're with, then you're too close. Because one of the things we know about COVID-19, the coronavirus, is it's mainly spread by the mouth. So it is by breathing loudly, by shouting, particularly in a confined space. And that seems to be its major mode of transmission. So people are also kind of freaked out about, here in the UK, shops have to kind of spray clean their clothes in between. And that is balmy. I mean, that's truly balmy, because there is no evidence really that COVID-19 gets transmitted via fabric or anything like that. And in supermarkets, you can go in, you can pick up food, someone else may have handled that food. But the actual risks of getting it via hand-to-hand transmission in that way are low. And if you wash your hands, then they are virtually nil. The major mode of transmission is certainly via the mouth. And that is one of the ways that we know that this coronavirus is different to other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, is the first place it infects is the nose and the throat. And that means you can transmit quite a lot simply by kind of talking. But it's more than talking, it's really kind of shouting and singing, which is why a lot of the outbreaks have been in places like churches or in bars or restaurants or places like that, confined spaces. That we know this stuff about COVID-19. So a lot of crazy stuff. People are frightened that if they go out and, outside and they pass somebody in the street, they'll get it. It's nonsense. You're not going to get it that way. It's indoors, it's close, it's stuff like that.
We've had a question come through on the Facebook chat from Tony Marshall, who says, "Hi, Michael. Love your books and TV programs. Why does COVID-19 make some people lose their sense of smell?"
Sure. And two of my sons have had COVID-19. One of them got it in Melbourne. And so I write a bit about that in the book. He was actually living with a couple of doctors in Melbourne. He was working there. And then he came back to the UK in the middle of March, 22nd of March. And I greeted him at the airport. He was perfectly fine. And the next morning, he got a call from one of the doctor friends to say that he had had a cough and been tested for COVID-19. And it turned out that 6 of them, all doctors in Melbourne, had all got COVID-19 and were in isolation. And that evening, Dan came down with it, and he was quite sick for a while. We put him into the bedroom upstairs, and he lost all sense of smell. And that seems to be largely because the virus attacks the nose. It goes in through the nose and to the back of the throat. And that's why one of the commonest symptoms is a cough. But another really common symptom is the loss of sense of smell, because what the virus is doing is it's targeting the nerve cells in your nose. And one of my other sons, Jack, who is a doctor up in near Manchester in the UK, he's working in the intensive care unit, and he came down with exactly the same symptoms: fever, cough, but loss of sense of smell. And 2 months on, their sense of smell has still not really recovered. So my wife, Dr. Claire Bailey, she has a Instagram account where you can find her, Instagram, Dr. Claire Bailey, where she does recipes, but I also posted some tests I did on Daniel, feeding him chilies and things like that, to see if his sense of taste and smell had returned. And sadly, they have not yet, though I'm sure they will. But that seems to be a very clear and common symptom of COVID-19, which initially was not that well recognized.
Kind of springboarding off a couple of the things that you mentioned there, in terms of the long-term effects of some of these symptoms and effects like losing a sense of smell, do we have an idea of what the long-term damage could be for people who recover?
Well, we know that around 80 to 85% of people have very mild symptoms, or they are like Jack or Dan. They have it a bit and then they shake it off. And a relatively small number end up in hospital. And they are almost all people who are over 65 who have a pre-existing condition like type 2 diabetes, like hypertension, or who are overweight, particularly obese. The risks, if you are under 50 and otherwise fit, are minuscule. And that is another misapprehension. And, you know, one of the tragedies here in the UK is they closed the schools down and they're really challenging to get them open again. Your risks of, you know, a serious, if you're under 19, the risks of your getting something bad from COVID-19 are about 1 in 3 million. You're 10 times more likely to die in an accident of any form, like a car accident, anything like that. It is a really, really small risk. And unfortunately, people got so freaked out about it. And again, some brilliant research done in Australia has shown that kids really don't get it. They really aren't affected by it, and they really don't give it to other people. The latest studies suggest that kids are really unlikely to transmit it to other kids. A big study in Australia found that when they looked into it, the kids who got it, they had 1,000 contacts. None of them got COVID-19. The odds of getting it are very, 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 very low. So I think people are freaked out about it, but this is a weird virus because almost every other form of virus kills young people as well as old people. So the flu kills the very young and the very old. This is exceptionally weird because it only kills people who are old or vulnerable, really. Very, very, very few people. There have been some deaths. In the UK, there have been 3 deaths of people under 19, but that's compared to something like 60 or 70,000 deaths of people, you know, who are over 60. So it's very clear who are the most vulnerable. And again, in the UK, it was a big mistake not to do more about isolating the people who are vulnerable. And that would be the way forward. And so I think, you know, that is something we have learned. And again, very confusing, a lot of the advice out there. But to be honest, what we should be doing is more strenuously shielding the people who are vulnerable and frankly letting other people, you know, mix more. And certainly opening the schools would be a hugely good thing to do because, you know, a whole generation are losing their education.
We've received another question in the comments that that I'd like to ask, which is, are we likely to see other novel viruses in our lifetime?
Yes, very much so. And that's something I also reflect on in the book, because we know when I was a medical student in the 80s, that was when AIDS erupted. Since then, we've had Ebola, we have had SARS, we have had MERS. The rate at which these pathogens are emerging is actually increasing. According to some research I saw, the rate has quadrupled since the 80s. So AIDS, you know, is still out there. It's killed 32 million people. It's still killing nearly 1 million people every year. We still haven't got it. The drugs are helping to control it, but certainly in places like Africa. So yeah, the rate at which these pathogens is emerging is accelerating. And that seems to be very much to do with the fact that we are encroaching on the spaces where the wild animals live. This one almost certainly came from bats, probably via an animal. We're not entirely sure which one, but it looks like, you know, it was an animal which is a bit like an anteater. And we know that this coronavirus is very similar to other coronaviruses, but it has a secret weapon, if you like. It has a mutation in its attachment, so it can cling to human cells much more avidly than other coronaviruses do. So that's why it is so much worse than SARS or MERS. So SARS and MERS, which were previous coronaviruses, they had much higher mortality rates. SARS killed 10%. MERS kills 30% of people who get infected. This one probably more like 0.5%. But it can spread much more widely because it does infect the throat. And because also its other secret weapon is the fact that you can have it, you can be spreading it, but you don't actually have any symptoms. So that is really why it spread. But yeah, unfortunately, more of those are coming with an absolute certainty. I've been doing documentaries about the threat of emerging viruses for 15 years, and they have come like clockwork, if you like, in fact, more regularly than clockwork. So I hope they're more prepared next time, because they're out there. We know that in bats, there are hundreds of other coronaviruses which are just dying to emerge sometime in the near future. And of course, there's flu.
I wanted to ask whether it was difficult to write the COVID-19 book as the events were unfolding.
Yes, so it was. I mean, the challenge was basically when to stop. because a lot of the stuff doesn't change. So, for example, things like how your immune system reacts. And I suspect most people really don't understand how the immune system reacts. So I kind of give you a sort of a relatively simple but straightforward account of how your immune system copes. The first stages, second stages, the various stages of attack by the virus, why some people become really ill, why some people don't, and what you can do to bolster, if you like, your immune system. All this stuff is really quite well established science. The first 100 days, the history is pretty clear as well. And the issues around things like the infectivity rate, around how infectious are kids, that stuff was established some time ago. The vaccine work and the drug work is progressing, but I made some predictions about the vaccines, and I'm pleased to say they seem to be bang on track. So we now have 5 vaccines which are front runners, 2 China, 2 in the US, and 1 in the UK, and 1 new one in the UK, which again is just going into trials. That's the one being done at Imperial. So there's a kind of interesting synergy there, because it was at Imperial College, or at least it was in St Mary's College, where it was the penicillin was first discovered. And it was Oxford, however, who produced the first effective drug in 1944. And it looks like Oxford will be the first people to produce an effective vaccine. They're on track to do it. The work has been phenomenal. The speed has been phenomenal, but I am really very confident. So as I said, there are 5 good contenders out there, and all the data is strong. So one of the things I slightly held back before finishing the book was looking at the human studies and the animal studies, and both of those came through. Both of those show a really good immune response to these vaccines. And the book came out really fast, because I only finished writing it about 3 weeks ago. So all power to Simon & Schuster for actually getting it out there that fast. It was speedy to write, but the rate at which it was published, you can get it obviously as an ebook, you can get it as a real book, and you can get it as an audio book. So I was having to record it in my cupboard upstairs, surrounded by Claire's clothes, to muffle the sound, which was novel. But it's amazing what you can do. Everything was done via the internet, obviously, and talking to the publishers, talking to everyone, all done remotely. And I'm very proud of the book. I think it's a good read, and I think it really does cover the ground. It does answer a lot of questions. And as I said, I'm really proud that it tells you something about the immune system, and it also tells you something about how you can bolster your immune system, because we know, again, one of the reasons why people get it is because their immune system is deficient. And we know that's because as you get older, your immune system becomes less effective. I talk about bolstering rather than boosting, because one of the things we know that kills you with COVID-19 is first of all, you have a weak reaction. The first part of the immune system fails to take out the virus, and then you get this overreaction, a sort of nuclear attack called a cytokine storm. And that's what really kills you. And that seems to be why the news which came out yesterday about dexamethasone, which is a steroid drug, which I also kind of write about, that was always a leading contender to help, suppress. It suppresses the wild overreaches of the immune system when you are, when you're on oxygen, or if you are, having to be intubated. So once you're in intensive care, then taking dexamethasone seems to have a dramatic impact on your survival rates. And it's the first drug that has been shown to do anything impressive. And unlike some of the others that have been hyped, like hydroxychloroquine, which Donald Trump was raving about, that one was a bit of a no-goer from the start. And it turns out it probably kills more people than it saves. And the more fancy ones like remdesivir are hugely expensive. And at the moment, the data suggests they're not terribly effective. So we are relying on a drug which costs less than $1 and has a 1 in 5 chance of saving you. So those are pretty good odds. But it only works on people who are seriously ill, because what it does is it suppresses the immune system, which is exactly what you don't want to do if you're just got a mild illness, but it's exactly what you do want to do if you're in intensive care.
We've got a couple more questions from the Facebook comments, and I just want to ask those and then move on to ask you a couple of quick questions about your other recent book, Fast Asleep. But the questions that we've had, Stephanie Beattie asks, is there evidence of people being infected twice? And then Sarah asks, are the symptoms as bad if people get it a second time?
Sure. So there were some stories from South Korea of people getting it twice. They get infected and then they get retested a month later and they still have presence of virus. Turned out they were all false. The thing is, the test they use where they shove it up your nose, the PCR test, all it does is it detects fragments of virus. It cannot tell you whether the virus is alive or dead. So all they were detecting was dead virus. The dead virus can hang around in your system for a while. So none of these people actually had viable virus. When they tried to grow it, it couldn't grow. So there is absolutely no evidence that you can get it twice, which is really reassuring because obviously that's hugely important from the point of view of a vaccine. So the great news from the point of the vaccine is most people seem to mount a good immune response. They not only mount an antibody response, but a T cell response. And again, I go into the book, the importance of the T cells. The T cells are things like T killer cells. So antibodies basically kind of latch onto the virus and stop it spreading in the blood and places like that. But the T killer cells are hugely important because they find cells that are infected with the virus and then they swoop in and they kill. So it turns out with coronavirus, the T killer cells are hugely important, but we don't have any good tests for that. So it could be that you have a negligible antibody response, but you have a really good T killer cell response. So yeah, it does not appear like you can get infected twice. And the evidence from other coronaviruses is that once you've had it, you appear to be immune for at least a couple of years. In the case of SARS, it appears to be 20 years. So again, there's a lot of stuff going on about, you can get infected, but I said, based on initial studies where they were detecting dead virus. So the good news is no, it seems to be that once you've had it, you've had it.
Okay. So before coronavirus came in and kind of changed the trajectory of the year, you published a book about sleep. And I assume you plan to talk a lot about sleep in 2020, and it probably hasn't happened. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit to that. So how important is sleep to general health?
Sure. So one of the things we all know now is that sleep is just incredibly important, both for your mental and your physical health, and indeed for your immune system. I kind of touched on it in the book, but since then it has become even more obvious. There was a fascinating study done in the States where they took, I think it was 140 healthy volunteers, and they brought them into a lab. And then what they did is they fitted them with an activity monitor. I'm wearing one now, so they could monitor their sleep. And then what they did is they squirted viruses up their noses, viruses that cause a common cold. And then they put them into a hotel nearby and they monitored them. And what they found was that if you slept less than 6 hours a night, compared to sleeping 7 hours or more, and that's just 1 hour difference, you are 4 times more likely to get an infection. So you are 4 times more likely to come down with a common cold. So all these people all squirted with exactly the same amount of virus up the nose, but your chance of actually getting the virus was 4 times greater, which shows you just what a big impact your sleep has on your immune system. We know that it's when you're in deep sleep that you produce some of the more important components of the immune system, like your antibodies, your T cells, and your cytokines. So yeah, sleep, the brain, and the body. So we know, for example, as well as the immune system, the brain, if you don't get enough sleep, there are channels in your brain during deep sleep which actually open up and swish through this sort of fluid. It's like a washing machine. You literally get brainwashed while you're in deep sleep, and all the gunk gets cleaned out. So if you're not getting enough deep sleep, then you're much more prone to dementia and forgetfulness and things like that. And that's a system which was only identified in the last 5 to 10 years.
So I wanted to ask, sleep is so important, clearly, for general health and for your mental health, as you've said before. Why do so many people struggle to get a good night's sleep?
I think there are a whole host of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons I wear an activity monitor, and they're pretty good these days, is so you can actually kind of monitor your sleep accurately, because on the whole, we tend to talk about, having having 8 hours, and that means going to bed 11 p.m., getting up at 7 a.m. But for at least an hour of that time, most people will be awake. And there are different stages of sleep. There is deep sleep, there is REM sleep, rapid eye movement, where your eyes flicker to and fro, and they do different things. And unfortunately, as you get older, your deep sleep tends to go off. Now, stress obviously plays a role in that, but also diet does as well. And we know that we're getting fatter and sicker as the years progress. That the average Australian now is really significantly overweight, like the average person in the UK, 60 to 70% are either overweight or obese. That means you're going to be snoring more. You're going to have sleep apnea, where you and then stop breathing and that is lethal. And around half the people who have sleep apnea don't know they have it. So your partner needs to monitor you. If you can stay awake and if you're at risk, it's much, much worse. Snoring is bad. Sleep apnea is lethal. It really does add to heart disease and things like that. And on top of that, we know that the impact of your diet on your microbiome, on your sleep, is pretty clear. And so one of the things I write about in Fast Asleep is the benefit of switching to a Mediterranean style diet, because we know that has a profound effect on stress, but also on sleep. It'll also help you lose weight. So another of the books I wrote was called The Fast 800, and I've got a website called thefast800.com, which gives you lots of advice. But we know that combining a Mediterranean diet with sleep, with weight loss, leads to much better, deeper sleep. And then once you get better sleep, then you'll lose weight as well. Because we know that when you're sleep deprived, you get hungry, you crave carbs. What you really want is a packet of chips or whatever it may be, or a biscuit or cookie. And people who get a poor night's sleep, on average, they eat about 300 calories more the next day. So the two are intertwined. That if you're overweight, sleeping badly, then you will crave junk food. And if you eat junk food, then that will make your sleep much worse. So there's a horrible vicious cycle going on there. But just as there's a vicious cycle, you can also induce a virtuous cycle. There's a lot of stuff, obviously, in the book around techniques for helping you go to sleep and improve the quality of your sleep. Because there are a number of excellent books out there telling you that if you don't get enough sleep, then you're going to die and your brain's going to rot. But none of them actually tell you anything terribly effective about what you can do about it. And I was a chronic insomniac for many years, so I tested out pretty well everything. I love self-experimentation. So I went through the whole list. And what you see in the book is a distillation of what I've learned, both from speaking to endless sleep scientists, but also from what I've done to myself. Sure, I've got my tea here.
Before we wrap up, we're getting some great questions in the chat, and I wanted to turn it over to some of those questions now. We've got some questions about sleep, some questions about coronavirus, so we might bounce back and forth between two subjects here. But the first question we have is from Channy Lang. She asks whether asthmatics are at higher risk of being severely ill or dying if they're infected with COVID-19.
Sure. So originally people thought they would be. Turns out not really. They're not in one of the really high risk groups. I mean, obviously, the really bad moment in COVID-19, it starts off in your nose and throat. For most people, it stays there, you get rid of it, your immune system clears it, you're fine. In some cases, unfortunately, it goes down into the lungs. So people make what appears to be a partial recovery, and then they get really, really sick. So the fear was that asthmatics, who have higher rates of inflammation and lung disease, they would get really ill. Turns out, no. Asthmatics are not the high-risk category. The really high-risk categories are being obese, having type 2 diabetes, and having high blood pressure. Those are the three big killers. There was a study from the CDC in the States recently which showed that if you have what's called metabolic disease, then your risk of becoming seriously ill and dying is increased 12-fold. 12-fold. That is absolutely phenomenal. So asthma, I'm pleased to say, is not on that high risk category. But if you have cancer and you're on immunosuppressive drugs, those also fall into the high risk categories. But it's mainly people with metabolic disease. And they tend to be people with kind of large guts, because unfortunately having a large waist means that you're going to be producing lots of inflammatory factors. And that seems to suppress your immune system. So one of the things I do say is, if you do have raised blood sugars, raised blood pressure, then I would urge you to do something about getting them down. And that really does mean losing weight. And the Fast 800 is all about losing weight fast and effectively and safely. Because if you do that, you will massively decrease your risk, not only of getting COVID-19, but other infectious diseases, such as the flu. You will also improve your chances that when the vaccine comes, it will work. Because we know that people who have type 2 diabetes or who are overweight or obese, the vaccine is likely to be half as effective. We know this from flu vaccines, that they work in around 95% of people who are slim and only about 90% of people who are overweight. That it doubles your risk that any vaccine will fail. So there are lots of important reasons, and this adds to the list why you might want to sort out your metabolic disease. And of course, your sleep will also improve.
We've got a question from Kylie Story. She says, I had a higher risk of infection having autoimmune disease, but on Plaquenil.
Yeah, that's tough. And all I can say is, you're fortunate, I assume you're in Australia. In Australia, Australia's done remarkably well. So at the moment, rates of COVID-19 are very small. The risk of being exposed are very small, but that is tough because it does mean there's a huge degree of uncertainty. Clearly, if you do go out, I'm sure you're wearing a mask, and that is mask and washing your hands really are the best two ways of reducing your exposure. The other places where you are most likely to get exposure are in bars, in churches, and on public transport. But you're better off in Australia than you would be in the UK, where rates are still high, and obviously far better off than in the States or somewhere like Brazil.
So we don't want to take up too much more of your time. Maybe two more questions. So one question that we have here from Sue Bobamine is, isn't there research to say that if you over-monitor your sleep, and it makes you more anxious about insomnia?
Okay, so it depends on your personality. And so I wear this some of the time, not all the time. I find it kind of interesting, if you like, and quite often you kind of know how well you're sleeping. I do have a section in the book about how to improve your sleep quality. And oddly, one of the ways to do it is by restricting your sleep. To do that, you want to measure your sleep efficiency. And to do that, you probably do want to use a tracker. So it really depends. I wouldn't, obsessively follow it, because you're right. If you obsess about sleep, you're lying there worrying about the fact you're not getting enough good quality sleep, then that's obviously not helpful. But I do think in the short term, it can be quite useful, but it's very much down to you. I do have a section in the book also about how to reduce anxiety, stress, simple breathing exercises and things you can do in the middle of the night. But stress clearly plays a significant role. But there are other things which are probably more important, which are things like diet. And as I said, sleep restriction is a surprisingly good way of cracking chronic insomnia. But you need to do it safely and you need to do it carefully. And it's part of something which is called CBT for insomnia, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It is probably the best proven way to cure yourself of insomnia, better than drugs, better than most other things. But combine that with changing your diet and your sleep routine, and there's a really good chance you'll be getting a good night's sleep.
All right, and the last question comes from one of your big fans who asks, are you already working on your next book? To which I would say, surely you deserve a break from writing books after having 2 out in such a short space of time.
Yeah, no, I'm having a bit of a breather now, but my wife, Dr. Claire Bailey, she's doing a book at the moment, which is called The Fast 800 Easy. So she is a GP, but she writes all the recipes for the books. So any fans of The Fast 800 or the Fast 800 recipe book, which has sold very well in the UK and Australia and all around the world, for those people who want to lose weight fast and quickly and get their diabetes, blood sugars, blood pressure, whatever it may be, under control, they will be pleased to know that she's got another recipe book coming out, which, as the name implies, is Fast 800 Easy. And so, sorry, can you still see me? My thing's telling me my battery is low.
Oh, we can still see you. Well, if you're about to run out of battery, let's quickly wrap it up. Dr. Michael Mosley, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and answer our questions. And if anybody out there wants to buy a copy of Faster Sleep or COVID-19 or any of your other books, they can do so right now on booktopia.com.au. Where can people find more of your work online?
Sure. So if you go to thefast800.com, you will find a lot of interesting and useful information there about a whole range of things. That will also, lead you to stuff around gut health, because I've written a book about that. It turns out that pretty well everything I've been writing books about for the last 8 years, they all interconnect, if you like, and they all point, again, they all will help your immune system, but everything connects to everything else. So thefast800.com is a good place to go, and it will lead you to other places as well.
Dr. Michael Mosley, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.
Pleasure.